Thank you so much for having me today. As Rob so graciously said, I am an academic at the University of Western Australia. My background is in hydrology, which is the science of how water works. And this means that today I'll largely confine my comments to exactly that topic, rather than getting in detail into legalities, governance, and planning. So those are not my areas of expertise, and if I get that stuff wrong, luckily we have some experts in the room. So I do just want to make you all aware of two people who I know, who are friends who are here today, who could be great resources for you. One of them is Shelley Shepherd. Shelley, do you want to give a wave and say hi? Hi. You can recognise her, the beautiful curly red hair. Shelley is right across planning policy and how it works with water. So if you have questions that are about that topic or something's unclear, I'd really encourage you to touch base with Shell. We also have in the room Don McFarlane. Don, do you want to give a wave? So Don has been in the space of managing water resources in Western Australia for a very long time. He knows the history of just about everything that's happened with water in Perth. And if you need to learn more about that sort of background, I would really encourage you to touch base with Don. So we all want to be resources for you as a community today. Before I go any further, I would also like to acknowledge that we are on Whadjuk Noongar Budja and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I always like to include the word Budja in these talks, this being the Noongar term for country, but with a sense not just of country being somewhere where we live, but of a place to which we have obligation. And I think that sense of stewardship and looking after land and our place is really what's actioning and motivating many of us here today. I also want to very quickly thank a couple of other people. Firstly, Amarul Azraf Shah Nizamuddin, who's also here today. Amarul, do you want to give a wave? So I'll be presenting data today from Amarul's master's thesis, and if you want to ask anything about data collection, he's here. I'd like to thank our tech, Andrew van der Ven, who's not here, but who you'll see in photos. And big thanks also to Harry Gratt, Cheryl Rogers and Rod Henderson, who you will hear from later today, for granting us access to their property so that we could do a bit of water monitoring. What I really want to do in this talk is two things. Firstly, I want to make sure that because we are going to be talking a lot about groundwater and the development of land in areas where the groundwater is shallow, I want to make sure that we all have some common understanding of the behaviour of groundwater, some of the terminology that you will see in the planning documents, and basically that we've got that fundamental background so we can have a conversation about this stuff that doesn't lead to anyone getting bamboozled by too many three-letter acronyms, of which there are many. What I then want to do is turn my attention really quickly to some of the work that we've been doing in the Dayton area primarily, and what that seems to be showing about how water is now behaving in the periphery of that suburb. So that's really the scope of things. And so where are we? Well, we're on the Swan Coastal Plain. I hope you can see this. And what I'm going to do is show a little bit of a cross-section of the land elevation of the Swan Coastal Plain, going from the Indian Ocean in the west through to the Swan River in the east, which is about 25 kilometres. And if we draw a slice through all of that and measure how high the land is, it looks a bit like this. That big peak in the middle, oh, whoops, a daisy, I've done something clever. That big peak in the middle is the Kundula area, and the flat zone over there, that's approximately Whiteman Park, just so that we're orientated. So when we think about development, one more thing about all of that is we don't just have changes in what the land surface is doing in terms of ups and downs, it's also made of different stuff. And particularly over in the west, we have lots of sandy soils, but as we move further east, we increasingly encounter areas where there's clay. And many of you guys will be familiar with this in your own yards. There's sands, there's clays, and they're often combined in complex ways. So that's where we are. And if we then think about what the groundwater might be doing, and this is very slightly made up, so please nobody hold my feet to the fire, but broadly what we see is the groundwater is there underneath all of these sediments, fed by the rain, emerging at the surface as lakes and basically omnipresent. But there's a real difference when we then think about urban development. And so initially in Perth, the prime areas for urban development have been on those sandy soils where we tend to have quite deep soils above the groundwater, except where we're right next to the lakes. And so this is where we sort of consider to be the premium land and historically have developed many of our suburbs. But as the city expands, we've pretty much run out of most of those kinds of landscapes. And so as we look at areas like the Northeast Corridor development, we're moving much more into these eastern soils. And so they are quite different places. What we really have is that our urban water management approaches have largely been developed in the Western type environment. And so the question is, well, if we're applying them in these eastern environments that we're in here, where we have higher groundwater, different clayey soils, so different soils, and perhaps less clearance between the land surface and the groundwater over more of the landscape, are those approaches going to work, or do we need to look at modifying them? So that's kind of where we are and setting some of the scene for development. I want to turn to the next question that we need to be really clear about, which is, what is this groundwater stuff anyway? And you probably have had the misfortune of asking that question and being shown a picture of an underground cave with a lake in it. That's certainly a kind of groundwater, but probably not the one that we're most often encountering. We see that is an invisible image. That's meant to be a picture of a well, and the water level you see in the well is the level of the groundwater. I'm sorry, that just hasn't come out. But broadly, groundwater is water that's stored in the pore spaces between the grains of soil or in cracks in the rocks. The image on the right-hand side is from the Grand Canyon. Sadly, we won't see too much of that around here. But basically, you can think of it as deep, wet mud, and the water that makes that mud wet is most of our groundwater. And there's a few things that we need to know about groundwater, and I'm going to start with a really basic one, which is that it moves. And it moves in response to particular things. So here's my attempt at sketching out a kind of see-through land surface. I've made all the soils see-through, and underneath that we would have our water sitting in the pores of the soils, forming what's called the water table. That water is going to move in response to three things. The first of these is called the hydraulic conductivity, and you might see it referred to as K-stat. This is basically the speed limit for how fast water can move through any particular soil, and it's going to be different in sands than in clays. A much higher speed limit in the sands, a much lower speed limit in the clays. The next thing that causes the water to move is when there is a slope to the water table, and this is really true for this situation where we have a water table. Slightly different if we were thinking about deep water that was trapped deep underground, so just the shallow stuff right now. So the slope of the water table is also called the hydraulic gradient, and you might see it in equations referred to as the gradient in something called H. And the reason I'm doing all of this is engineers get involved and we like equations, and we might accidentally bamboozle you with equations. So I'm again trying to unbamboozleify things. So we've got the speed limit, we've got the slope, we've got one more thing, and that's just how much water there is to actually flow through. What's the area that is saturated, filled with water, where that flow is happening? So if I increase the speed limit, if I increase that slope, or if I increase that area that's saturated where the groundwater can flow, I'm going to have more groundwater flow, and vice versa. First thing to know about groundwater. Although this makes it look like a very three-dimensional sort of a thing, which it is, we don't get to look at it that way most of the time. We mostly get to look at the groundwater by measuring it in just one place at a time, by drilling down and making a bore or a well, or as it says and can't probably be read on the image, a piezometer. Again, we've got lots more jargon. And what we do at those places is we just measure how that water table is going up and down. So what's the level of the water in the well? And if we're measuring it really nice and frequently, we could make a graph a bit like the one there. So this is one of our local wells. We've measured water in it several times a year since the 1970s, and we see these patterns and these trends over time. When we look at what's happening in any year, we usually see the groundwater going down as the land surface dries out, because we have our hot, long, dry summers, and we see it going up again when we get our cold, wet winters. That drying time you might hear called a recession, That rising time might be called the rising limb, and this whole graph is often called a hydrograph. Oh, so much terminology. This rising limb is happening because of rainfall. It's specifically happening because of rainfall getting through the dry soil, reaching the water table, and that's a process that's called recharge. So recharge is a word you're going to hear a lot, and it really just means the conversion of rainfall into the amount of water that actually gets to the groundwater. We don't really need to look about that. How much recharge we have, we usually estimate by saying, well, if we'd kept on falling until we got to the point where we've risen all the way, what would that difference be? So if we're measuring a recharge, it's basically a rise in that water table. So this is probably how you'll see information about groundwater conveyed to you. What does it all mean? Well, if we go up to the highest point in the groundwater, the annual peak water level, that means a few things. On the bad side, if this gets really high, we're going to get soggy ground in the winter, we're going to get groundwater flooding, the sorts of things that many of you will have experienced in soggy, boggy places. On the other hand, this is also what's really controlling things like the flow of water in winter to our rivers, our creeks and our wetlands. So there's potential negatives and nuisances, but also real positives associated with that high water level. The low water level, on the plus side, this means we've actually got space underground to store our water in, and this is why we do so well with soak wells as a place to dispose of our rainwater in the city of Perth. We've got that space. So that's great. If there's a nice low water table, we can put water there. On the other hand, if that water table is getting too low, this is also the water that should be available to keep our ecosystems growing, and that is sustaining water levels in our creeks and our wetlands during the summer. And if we don't have it, I'm so sorry, this is invisible, but that's a very dried out Beaver Lake on the right hand side. So again, there's positives and negatives associated with how low that groundwater gets. When it comes to thinking about what urbanisation should do to groundwater, we manage something that we call the AAMGL. I promised you there would be acronyms, and here they come. So that is the annual average maximum groundwater level. So what are we doing? We're finding all of these high points of every year. We're finding them for lots of years. We're taking the average and we say we're going to manage this. And we can always have fights over how many years go into that and what we should measure for how long, blah, blah, blah. But this is the thing that we're trying to manage. On average, how high does that water get? AAMGL. So how do we manage that? What do you do? Well, what we usually do is we manage it with this very fancy piece of infrastructure, a slotted drainage pipe. This stuff has a much higher speed limit than soil. So water will flow into it from the groundwater and be taken away quite rapidly. And so if we've got these in the groundwater, they will tend to take any water above it into the drain and convey it away if everything's working the way it's supposed to. So when we think about urban development, we put these subsoil drains in underground and we use them to control how high we think the groundwater should get. And when we have those in place, we call the elevation of those drains the controlled groundwater level. Here's another acronym, the CGL. Our rules about urban development are often centred on this CGL. And the main rule for the CGL is that it can't be too low. And that's because we really want to protect places like the swamps in Whiteman Park. If we put the CGL too low and we get too good at pulling the groundwater out, we're going to lower the water table, and those water levels in winter and summer will be too low for these ecosystems to be good. So our rules have been that when it comes to urban development, our controlled groundwater level, our depth of the drains, have to be at or above the average annual maximum groundwater level. That is, we can't make the water table get lower as a consequence of development, because we are protecting groundwater dependent ecosystems. Shit, there's another one. GDEs. We're protecting them from drying up. So that's great, but it does leave the question, where in this system is there then protection from urbanisation actually causing groundwater to rise and lead to flooding? because it's not there in saying that the CGL needs to be at or above AANGL. That's to prevent the groundwater from falling. So what we are generally doing to protect from groundwater flooding, which again we've probably all seen examples of lately, is that we rely on the developers to talk about a separation distance between the maximum peak of where the groundwater gets to, how high it gets to, and what they call the finished surface, which is the land surface after you've finished your development process. And usually we've got some fixed separation distance that will be part of those urban water management plans. Now, we might have a problem there, right? Because our CGL isn't allowed to go too low, and our land surface, if we have shallow groundwater, might be closer to the CGL than that separation distance is. So developers might have to lift up the land surface in order to get that separation distance. So my little teeny weeny blue arrow there, that's my separation distance. And if I need to, I'm going to import fill, I'm going to lift up the land surface so that I achieve that separation distance above the groundwater, because I can't make the groundwater go lower because we're protecting our ecosystems. So this is pretty much the way that we try to manage high water levels in urban developments. In general, the idea that this separation distance is something developers care about and are going to ensure that they have in place works quite well, because high groundwater really increases costs for home building. And that's because the kind of a foundation you can put on your house depends on this whole set of site classifications, and everybody wants a Class A, which means the groundwater's low enough. Because if you don't have a Class A, you've got to build a more expensive foundation. So the economics of the situation should mostly protect us from groundwater flooding. And in general, overall, I would say that this system of both engineering and planning is pretty sound. It works pretty well over a lot of the city. Not saying it's perfect, not saying it can't be improved, not saying it's working here, but it's got a pretty decent track record. Our trouble is, I think, twofold. One part is that the implementation's not always perfect. And many of you may be familiar with the Whiteman Edge development with a very lovely living stream in it. Living stream being a stormwater drain that we put vegetation in order to make it more ecologically valuable. And this stream has had a bit of a tendency to do something weird for streams on the Swan Coastal Plain. It flows for most of the year. Most of our streams don't do that. And we believe that it does this because during the implementation phase, somebody managed to lose a letter in one of the acronyms, and our AANGL may have been replaced by the AAGL. That's no longer the annual average maximum groundwater level, but just the annual average groundwater level, which is about ½ a metre lower. And this could well mean that our subsoil drains in this area are actually inside where the water table usually is, and probably are lowering that water table and producing all of this flow, which I believe is ending up in Horse Swamp in Whiteman Park, so maybe someone's a winner out of all of this anyway. So things aren't always implemented perfectly, and that's unsurprising. There's a lot of development going on. This is complicated. There's a lot of parties involved. But there's another issue with this approach, and that is that this idea of saying we can't lower the groundwater, but we have to have enough separation, that protects the development area from flooding, but it does not protect neighbouring areas. And I think this is one big issue that we're hitting in the Swan Valley. So you may recognise this. I recognise this as a blur on the screen. This is Dayton, and driving around Dayton last winter, we were privileged to be shown around by the good folks of the neighbourhood, and there's Harry having a little bit of a swim in an impromptu groundwater fed swimming pool. We've got giant pumps that the city has had to put in to actually get water out of the site. It's really clear that there's too much water in this environment, and it's not being conveyed away. Something about this process has not worked in Dayton. And it's been really hard to have conversations about this, in part because sometimes we talk to government departments and they say, well, you know, actually, how can the groundwater be rising? It's been falling since the 1970s. Look at our wells. Okay, well, let's have a look at their wells. The central rectangles there are the Brabham and Dayton developments. The red dots are where the Department of Water and Environmental Regulation has long-term monitoring wells, And you'll notice something about them. They're all either within or to the west of this development corridor. We don't have long-term monitoring east of the development site. If we go to these wells, it is certainly true that groundwater is lower today than it was in the 1970s. We've had a drying climate, we've been using groundwater resources, this is absolutely the case. But if we zoom in a little bit more and we look at what's been happening since development began in 2010, what we find at the majority of these wells is that that drying trend looks a little bit like it's reversing. And in fact, we see that in 7 of the 9 wells that are closest to this development area. So it's not really clear that we're still in a drying situation according to these monitoring wells. The bigger problem though is that they are biased towards the west rather than east of the development. And so we've zoomed in a little bit to the area in the blue rectangle with the little triangles that you probably can't see. That's Harry and Cheryl's tree farm. And Amarul's work over last winter and spring involved measuring the groundwater and how it was behaving at that farm across 4 different areas. Now, what I'm showing in the plot with all the arrows on the right is that idea of the slope of the water table, that one important factor that governs how things are moving, and its direction. And the key takeaway here is that the groundwater is moving to the east. So any impacts from this development are moving away from the long-term monitoring network, at least on this side, and they're not being seen by that network, but they are being felt by the property owners. So we went and we measured those other things that matter for flow. So here we've got Amarul and Andrew measuring the soil permeability. We come out with a KSAT, that speed limit, all very good. And then we said, okay, well, can we work out how much more water is moving just into this tree farm area because of the development? We've got the slope, we've got the speed limit, we need that area that the water's moving through, and this is where the fact that Harry has been measuring what's going on in terms of water depths for the past 10 years becomes really helpful, because it's clear, you just need to see that the lines down the bottom come from 2014, 2015, the lines at the top are recent and everything else basically fills in the difference. That water table is now about 1 metre or more higher than it was in the past. So if we take all those bits together, we can work out how much water is flowing into the tree farm, and we can say, well, it's attributable at least to this change in water level, which is very coincident with the development. So I'm going to go ahead and say it's probably attributable to the development. Oh, losing my boots. So there's our water table slope. It's about 15 millimetres a metre. We've got an extra metre of water. We've got our speed limit. Let's whack it together. Well, across every metre of the boundary of that tree farm, we do the maths, and it's basically like every day someone goes on every metre of the tree farm boundary and pours 11 milk bottles of water onto it every day. And on day 1, that's probably not a big issue, but if that goes on every day for a long time, that's quite a lot of extra water. In fact, it's so much extra water that if you multiply it by a year and the full length of the tree boundary, it's basically 2 Olympic-sized swimming pools of extra water that are now flowing through that property that 12 years ago were not. It's a chunk of water, and you have to remember, it doesn't come in swimming pool form, it's happening underground, so it's only in the spaces in the pores. It's like a much bigger volume in terms of how much the impact is. So we would say there's definitely evidence of the groundwater flowing from the development into properties to the west, and it's not a trivial volume. So how did we get here? Can we work out what went wrong? We've had a good look at the planning documents, and there's a few things that stand out as to what might contribute to getting to this point. But I think the really major one is that our planning system does not explicitly require anybody to manage off-site groundwater impacts. When we install drains at an elevation that's greater than the historical maximum groundwater level, it doesn't protect off-site areas from being flooded if the groundwater in the development area significantly rises. You can't see the photo here, but this is a really important photo because it's the only evidence we have of where the subsoil drains are actually installed, and they are installed above the natural groundwater surface in the fill. They're at least 2 metres higher up than the original groundwater surface was before development. So the groundwater has been allowed within the development area to be able to rise by at least 2 metres before it starts to be controlled by drains. And this is where I kind of come back to, well, hang on. Sorry.
Where is that photo?
Now, Harry, can you tell me? That's where the retention wall blew out next to Keller's. Thank you. Sorry, I was going to get it wrong.
2 metres. 2 metres.
It's at 2 metres?
2 metres high. What'd you say?
So the groundwater used to be about 2 metres below the land surface.
Yes.
This is sitting above the land surface, so it's at least 2 metres higher if this is now controlling groundwater. It's had that room to rise.
Thank you.
Yeah. And yeah, it's a shocker of a photo, that one, so yeah, anyway. So move forward. Move forward, you. There we go. So this is where I sort of think maybe we come back to a bit of a gap in the planning system a little bit. Because if we think about what happens when we've got deep sands and deep groundwater, even if we build a really high fill layer and we let the groundwater rise inside that development area, well, what happens? We get a rise, but we get those really steep slopes at the edges. And that slope means that the water mostly flows down and it flows away pretty fast. So even if we kind of stuff up everything about our water planning, if we're on deep sands, we've got a really big buffer. But when we move this to somewhere with shallow groundwater and lots of clay, like the Swan Valley and the North East Corridor, and we let the same thing happen, well, now we're mostly going to have shallower slopes that are mostly going to send water off the site and into neighbouring properties. So there's really a need to think about controlling how high groundwater should be allowed to rise within development areas. And I think that's probably the main thing that we should be thinking about addressing. There's other really long-standing challenges with our planning system of water management that have probably contributed to the challenges here. And we know that we put a lot on our local governments in terms of asking them to review highly technical documents and make very technical decisions and say something is okay or not, often under a lot of pressure to try to get decisions made. But it does lead to planning and water management happening bit by bit. So just looking at some recent planning in Dayton, this is that top northeastern corner, so right adjacent to the tree farm. Back in 2019, JDA, who are a consulting company, estimated that recharge would increase by about 40% because of changing this area to being urban. And they said that's going to cause the water table to rise by 1.5 metres a year. They then said we don't need a controlled groundwater level, which I guess is because they knew that the water was coming up. I'm not quite sure why that decision was made. And all of their mapping just showed a 1.5 metre rise in the water table, which sort of makes me wonder what they assumed was going to happen after year one. So I don't know if something went wrong. I don't know quite why those decisions were made. But what I do know is that the adjacent parcels of land, which are really, really similar in 2024, also went through some urban water planning. Now, none of this referenced the 2019 report. None of this mentioned the potential for water table rise. And again, said we don't need a controlled groundwater level. As a hydrologist, I find these decisions somewhat confusing, but I don't know why they were made the way they were, and I don't want to point fingers at anyone for making a mistake. I do want to say that when we start to look at new areas, new planning in different parts of Perth takes the prospect of groundwater rise quite seriously. I was having a look at the East Wanneroo area and the urban water management plans that have been written there, which I'll quote, say key risks to development are associated with predicted groundwater level rise, including waterlogging, loss of amenity, damage to infrastructure, loss of capacity of the stormwater system, mozzies and other nuisance insects. And the map that you can't see on the left there is a map of all the areas that the consultants have identified as being vulnerable to rising groundwater levels in East Wanneroo, which is really different to how this problem has been treated in the northeastern corridor. And so the note I will leave on is just to say, is it not reasonable to expect an equivalently serious treatment of this problem in this part of the city?
Thank you.